Welcome to Veil of Epochs. Tonight, we journey into one of the darkest chapters of human history, a time when fear and superstition unleashed a terrifying wave of fanaticism. The medieval witch hunts were not simply about magic or folklore, they revealed the raw and unsettling depths of human psychology, society, and power. In the shadows of churches and castles, millions of innocent lives were destroyed, accused of crimes they never committed. Behind every trial, every accusation, and every execution, lies a story of faith twisted into fear, of communities torn apart, and of the tragic consequences of blind belief. Join me as we unravel the chilling truth behind the witch hunts, a story of cruelty, survival, and ultimately, the resilience of reason in the face of hysteria. It began not with fire, but with fear. Long before the roaring flames of public executions or the ink-stained parchments of inquisitors, the seeds of the European witch hunts were sown in whispers, hushed voices in candle-lit chambers, murmurs of strange happenings in forests, sudden illness, or a cow giving sour milk. In an age when faith was stronger than fact, when illness was punishment from heaven and nature's mystery was the devil's trickery, the Middle Ages became fertile ground for a nightmare to flourish. The belief in magic and supernatural forces was ancient, predating Christianity. Pagan Europe was filled with stories of wise women, healers, midwives, and village seers, figures who existed on the margins of society but were sometimes respected, sometimes feared. With the rise of Christianity and the spread of the Church's authority, these figures began to be recast. Healing with herbs became sorcery, divination became heresy, and the wise woman became the witch. In the early medieval centuries, the Church itself was uncertain how to treat accusations of witchcraft. Canon law in the 8th and 9th centuries even discouraged belief in witches, labeling them as delusions of the ignorant. But this position would not last. By the 13th century, Europe was changing. The Church's power had become centralized and militant, its authority threatened by heretical movements, social unrest, and the slow emergence of proto-scientific thinking. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX established the Inquisition, originally meant to root out heresy. But in time, its targets expanded. Heretics were no longer just those who questioned doctrine, they were those who consorted with demons. The devil, once a distant force of evil, was now imagined as walking among men, corrupting women, tempting the weak, and teaching secret knowledge. And what better agents for his work than witches? The first sparks of Europe's great witch hunts did not arise in the darkest corners of peasant villages, they were lit in the minds of scholars, priests, and inquisitors. By the 14th century, Europe was already wounded. Waves of plague had ravaged the population, killing tens of millions. Famine, war, and religious schism created a landscape of despair. People sought answers, and the Church, once a bastion of stability, began to fracture. The papal schism, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon, weakened central religious authority. Into this chaos came fear. One of the earliest large-scale witch hunts erupted in the Valais region of Switzerland around 1428. Dozens of men and women were accused of attending Sabbaths, cursing crops, consorting with devils. Torture was used to extract confessions, and executions followed swiftly. The madness spread to France, Germany, Italy, feeding off itself like a fire that found dry timber in every village. Then came the most infamous text of all, Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. The book was a brutal manual for identifying, interrogating, and destroying witches. Though initially rejected by some church authorities, its widespread printing ensured it became one of the most influential books in Europe, second only to the Bible. The Malleus declared that women were inherently more susceptible to the devil's influence due to their emotional weakness, lust, and uncontrollable tongues. It laid out grotesque methods of torture, patterns of behavior to watch for, and insisted that leniency was complicity with Satan. Soon, civic and religious courts adopted these procedures. Witchcraft became a crime punishable by death. Neighbors accused each other out of fear or vengeance. The line between the sacred and the demonic blurred. Justice became theater, confessions extracted under pain. Spectacles of execution performed to cleanse entire towns. By the early 1500s, the German-speaking lands, fragmented into dozens of small principalities, became the epicenter of the terror. Some villages lost nearly all their women. In Würzburg, entire families were exterminated. In Ellwangen, 400 people were executed in a single wave of trials. The witch had become a scapegoat, a convenient enemy in a time where chaos ruled and certainty was craved. The accusation of witchcraft in medieval Europe was a death sentence, not immediately, but inevitably. The trial, once it began, was rarely about discovering the truth. It was about affirming fear, satisfying power, and purging the unknown. The victims were not only poor, though many were. They were often social outliers, women who lived alone, who practiced herbal healing, who bore no children, or who simply spoke too loudly. Widows with no male protectors were especially vulnerable. Their independence was threatening in a world where the church viewed order, male-dominated, obedient, quiet, as godly. Sometimes, victims were young girls, accused of looking oddly at cattle that later died. Other times, they were old women, blamed for a neighbor's miscarriage, a sudden illness, or bad weather. Some were midwives who lost a child during delivery. Others were cunning folk, local healers, once respected, but now seen as diabolical. When suspicion turned to accusation, the procedure began with arrest and confinement. Suspects were denied legal counsel. They were isolated, sometimes starved, and repeatedly interrogated. Torture followed. The Inquisition, both secular and ecclesiastical, used instruments that could turn bones to pulp: the rack, thumbscrews, the strappado, suspension by the arms, or the heretic's fork to prevent sleep or speech. The accused were forced to confess, not just to being witches, but to attending Sabbaths, nightly demonic orgies, to copulating with the devil, to flying through the air or transforming into animals. Under unbearable agony, many admitted anything their torturers wished to hear. Some even named others, and so the circle widened. Yet even confession did not guarantee mercy. Most who confessed were burned at the stake. Some were hanged first, then set alight, a small kindness. Others, in rarer instances, were drowned, especially in Eastern Europe. What made it worse was the ritual. Executions were public, held in central squares, often with priests delivering sermons. Children watched. Neighbors prayed. The flames were not only meant to destroy flesh, but to cleanse the soul and warn the living. Perhaps the darkest irony of it all was this: many who were executed as witches believed themselves innocent Christians to the very end. The persecution of witches in medieval Europe did not emerge in chaos. It was codified, systematized, and justified by both crown and cross. Though rooted in local superstition, The witch hunts became a sweeping phenomenon only when political and religious institutions gave them structure and legitimacy. In the early Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft were mostly local affairs. Villagers whispered. Clergy preached caution. Trials were rare. But the turning point came with the centralization of power, as monarchs sought to control unruly provinces. And the Catholic Church aimed to root out all perceived heresies. The fear of heresy was not abstract. To the medieval Church, heresy was not just theological error, it was a disease of the soul that could infect entire communities. And in the worldview of that time, witches were seen as heretics in service of the devil. By the 13th century, the Inquisition had emerged, an ecclesiastical court designed to identify and destroy heresy. Initially targeting groups like the Cathars or Waldensians, the Inquisition gradually expanded its reach. With the papal bull Vox in Rama, 1233, Pope Gregory IX linked heresy and sorcery directly to satanic worship. This marked a critical shift. Witchcraft was no longer mere superstition, it was now theological treason. By the 15th century, the obsession deepened. In 1486, two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. This book became the definitive manual for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. Its pages dripped with paranoia and misogyny, asserting that women were inherently weaker in faith and more likely to serve Satan. The book was filled with grotesque imagery, witches desecrating the Eucharist, flying to Sabbaths, seducing priests, and devouring infants. Civil authorities, once hesitant, began to embrace the witch hunts. Monarchs, eager to prove piety and consolidate power, authorized mass trials. The Church, in turn, needed secular cooperation to carry out sentences, especially executions. Thus, an alliance formed, the altar and the throne worked hand in hand. In places like Germany, France, and Scotland, local courts, now influenced by inquisitorial methods, conducted hundreds of trials. Town councils financed witch finders, and landowners saw an opportunity. Accused witches often had their property seized upon conviction. The witch craze was no longer spontaneous, it was bureaucratic. Entire towns became engulfed in procedural terror. Parish records were examined, midwives questioned, children interrogated to testify against their own mothers. Fear became law, and the law became fear. Perhaps most haunting was how ordinary people became participants. Neighbors turned informants. Priests condemned their parishioners. Executioners became numb. The machinery of persecution was now oiled by social pressure, political ambition, and theological fervor. In medieval towns and isolated villages, fear spread like a fever. Once a single accusation of witchcraft was uttered, it was rarely contained. The machinery of suspicion fed upon itself, transforming ordinary communities into hives of paranoia. The social order began to unravel, not with armies or rebellions, but through whispers, glances, and prayers laced with fear. It often began with a failed harvest or a sudden illness. A cow stopped giving milk. A child became sick. A hailstorm destroyed the crops. In a society with limited understanding of disease or climate, people reached for the supernatural. And in every village, there was always someone who lived on the margins: the old widow, the solitary midwife, the herbalist who spoke to herself. These were the first to fall. Once suspicion took root, it spread like wildfire. Community leaders, desperate to restore order or demonstrate devotion, held public meetings. Priests spoke of Satan's army hiding in plain sight. Parents warned children not to look strangers in the eye. Friends began watching each other with unease. The act of accusing someone became a twisted act of self-preservation. If you pointed the finger at another, it meant the fire would not consume you. Children were manipulated to testify. Servants turned against masters. Husbands accused wives. The line between guilt and innocence no longer mattered, only how convincingly one could display virtue by condemning evil. This was the beginning of witch panics, large-scale hunts not driven by royal decree or papal order, but by entire populations succumbing to mass hysteria. Between the late 15th and early 17th centuries, Europe experienced more than 100 known witch panics. Some lasted months, others years. In the German town of Würzburg, over 900 people were executed during a single wave, including children as young as 9. And the mayor's own son. In the small town of Ellwangen, hundreds were burned over the span of 5 years. Often, those who tried to stop the madness, a skeptical priest, a reluctant magistrate, were themselves accused. The cycle was self-protecting, self-fulfilling. Once in motion, it could not be reasoned with. Even towns with literate populations, where books, sermons, and legal knowledge existed, were not immune. The very tools of logic and religion were used to justify the chaos. Theologians cited scripture. Judges quoted the Malleus Maleficarum. The law became a sword in the hands of blind fear. And at the center of it all was fire. The spectacle of execution was not just punishment, it was purification. People gathered in city squares to watch. Vendors sold food nearby. Children clutched their mothers as the flames rose. The condemned often confessed under torture, then recanted, then confessed again. Their screams were said to drive away demons. What was left behind was not justice, but silence. Entire neighborhoods erased. Families destroyed. The names of the dead forgotten, their only legacy the echo of their screams in the minds of those who watched and said nothing. Her name was Anke Keller. Though that name would eventually be erased from every record in the village of Tolenheim. She had lived for nearly 60 years in the same stone cottage on the edge of the forest, where the oak trees grew thick and the mist lingered into the afternoon. Her husband had died long ago, a carpenter who never returned from war. Her son had perished in a plague that struck the village 2 decades earlier. Since then, she had lived alone, growing herbs, tending bees, and offering remedies to the sick. Anke was not feared. She was useful, until she was not. In the autumn of 1594, the rains came late and the wheat harvest failed. The village priest warned that sin had settled over the town. At the same time, a merchant's child fell ill with seizures, screaming of devils in the night. A group of townsmen approached the priest with their fears, and it was then that Anke's name was spoken aloud. She lives alone, they said. She knows too much about the old ways. My child took her tea and grew worse. She walks barefoot to the woods and whispers to trees. Fear gave birth to certainty. Within a week, she was dragged from her home, her jars smashed, her bees burned. In the center of the town square, beneath the watchful eyes of the priest and the mayor, she was interrogated for 7 days. Not with questions, but with fire, rope, and iron. Her ankles were crushed, her arms dislocated. She was shown the pyre being built outside the walls. She denied everything. Then, on the 5th night, under the crushing weight of agony and exhaustion, she confessed. She admitted to flying at night, consorting with demons, poisoning the well, and cursing the wheat. She named others. She even recited the devil's name. None of it was true. But by then, truth had become irrelevant. Her trial lasted 2 hours. Her execution was attended by over 300 villagers. The priest offered her salvation if she repented. And she whispered, "God already sees my soul." Then they bound her to the stake. As the flames climbed her body, her last words were lost in the roar of fire. That same evening, 2 more women were arrested. The witch hunts had come to Tolenheim. And in the decades that followed, no one spoke of Anke Keller. Her home was torn down. Her garden burned with salt. Her name was never written again. But among the oldest trees in the forest, the moss still grows thick. And the bees, they say, still return. By the early 15th century, witchcraft was no longer seen merely as a local superstition. It had become a systemic threat in the eyes of religious and secular authorities, a spiritual infection said to be corrupting entire communities. To fight this invisible enemy, powerful institutions took over. The Catholic Church, already facing challenges from heresies, reform movements, and growing dissent, began to refocus its inquisitorial machinery. Originally created to root out heretics, the Inquisition was increasingly used to investigate witchcraft. The logic was simple and terrifying: if witches worked with the devil, then rooting them out was not just legal, it was a divine duty. But this wasn't simply spiritual warfare. It was a performance of control. Church authorities, particularly after the publication of the infamous book Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, in 1487, began conducting widespread campaigns to teach parish priests, judges, and even monarchs how to identify and prosecute witches. Written by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor, the book became a blueprint for horror. It claimed women were more susceptible to demonic temptation due to their weaker faith. And it gave step-by-step instructions for torture, interrogation, and forced confessions. Local rulers, eager to consolidate power and eliminate enemies or scapegoats, saw an opportunity. Witch hunts provided a way to channel public fear, divert blame from poor leadership, and unify populations under a common enemy. Many regional courts became enthusiastic participants. In parts of Germany, Switzerland, and France, entire towns were swept up in mass trials. The accused were not just lonely women or healers, they were sometimes priests, midwives, merchants, or even children. In Würzburg, over 900 people were executed in a few years, including the city's own bishop's nephew. Each town would form a tribunal, often made up of clergy, local judges, and noblemen. Charges were based on vague accusations: bad weather, spoiled milk, sudden illness. Torture was used not just to extract confessions, but to force the accused to name others. This fueled chain reactions of paranoia. Every trial created more suspects. These events were rituals of public terror. Executions were often staged as spectacles, drawing crowds from surrounding regions. Sermons were preached, children were warned, and the fires burned for hours. But behind the flames was a carefully built structure, a partnership of faith, law, and fear. What began as isolated suspicions had become a systematic purge, backed by legal codes, sanctioned by theologians, and driven by bureaucratic efficiency. Long before the trials and flames, the idea of the witch already haunted the edges of European life, in stories whispered at hearths, in woodcut illustrations, in the silence of the forest after sunset. The fear of witches was not born in courtrooms or churches, it was nurtured in fields, villages, and dreams. To the medieval mind, The world was filled with spirits. Trees, rivers, and mountains held invisible forces. Illness might be caused by a curse. A poor harvest could be the result of a neighbor's jealousy. Magic was not fantasy, it was part of reality. In this landscape of superstition and survival, the figure of the witch became a vessel for all fears: famine, disease, infertility, and death. Witches were believed to blight crops, steal milk from cows, and cause miscarriages. More sinister still, they were accused of flying to Sabbaths, demonic gatherings in remote places where they worshipped the devil, feasted on unholy food, and fornicated with demons. These beliefs were passed through oral tradition. A grandmother would warn her grandchildren not to stare too long into the woods. A farmer might explain an outbreak of disease by blaming the strange woman who lived alone on the hill. The image of the witch became codified in symbols. Cats, particularly black ones, were thought to be familiars, spirits that served witches. Cauldrons became associated with potions and poisons. Brooms were believed to be vehicles of flight, possibly inspired by ancient pagan rituals of fertility in which women rode poles in planting ceremonies. And always, it was women who were the center of these stories. In a world where women's power was tightly controlled, where speaking too loudly, knowing too much, or living alone could draw suspicion, the archetype of the witch gave communities a target. Midwives, herbalists, widows, and childless women were especially vulnerable. Their knowledge of healing herbs or unusual births might be seen as unnatural or demonic. Even church teachings fed into this. Stories of Eve's original sin, of women's inherent weakness, and their supposed susceptibility to temptation created a moral framework in which femininity itself became suspect. Witches, then, were seen not just as dangerous, but as spiritually polluted. Over time, the folklore of the witch merged with apocalyptic fears. Plagues, wars, and famine drove people to seek explanations. In their desperation, they turned to the old stories, and to the authorities who promised salvation through fire. Once suspicion had taken root, the wheels of medieval justice could turn with a terrifying inevitability. Accusation alone was often enough to destroy life, and once named, escape was nearly impossible. The process usually began in secret. A neighbor, a child, or even a jealous rival might whisper an accusation to a local priest or magistrate. The accused, often unaware they were even under suspicion, could be arrested without warning. In the darkness of early morning, they might be dragged from their homes and taken to the local castle dungeon, or later, to specially designated witch prisons. The legal structure that governed these trials was not uniform, but many drew influence from the Inquisition, the Church's powerful mechanism for rooting out heresy. Witchcraft, being viewed as a pact with the devil, was treated as heretical, and thus subject to the harshest interrogations. The cornerstone of these interrogations was confession, and to get it, torture was often not just permitted, it was institutionalized. There were chilling instruments created for this purpose. The strappado hoisted a victim by their wrists tied behind their backs, dislocating shoulders. The thumbscrew crushed bones slowly, methodically. The iron chair, heated from beneath, inflicted burns on the flesh while the accused was restrained and questioned. The rack stretched limbs to the point of snapping. Even sleep deprivation, forced standing, or mock executions were employed to shatter a person's will. The cruel irony was that even the most absurd confession, flying on brooms, consorting with demons, or transforming into animals, was taken as proof of guilt. The more bizarre the tale, the more it confirmed that the devil was at work. And of course, any resistance to confessing could be seen as proof of demonic protection. Many victims, under agony, confessed to anything. They named names, often of neighbors or family. Thus, the web expanded. Fear metastasized. Judges, especially in areas like Germany or Switzerland, often relied on printed witch-hunting manuals to guide their actions. The most notorious was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer. It provided both theological justification and legal procedures for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. It argued that women were more prone to witchcraft due to their moral and physical weaknesses, a deeply misogynistic premise that shaped the trials for generations. The accused were rarely allowed proper defense. Trials were short, often secret, and usually predetermined. Many never lived to hear their sentence. Execution, usually by burning, was not just punishment, but spectacle. Townspeople gathered to watch. Sermons were preached. Banners were flown. The flames that consumed the accused were seen as both purification and warning. These trials did more than kill. They instilled fear in entire communities, silencing dissent, controlling women, and enforcing conformity through terror. The witch hunts of the Middle Ages and Renaissance cannot be understood without diving into the spiritual landscape of the time, a world where the supernatural was not folklore, but reality, where invisible battles between God and Satan were believed to rage every day. All around, in every illness, every storm, and every misfortune. Christian Europe in the late medieval period was obsessed with the cosmic battle between good and evil. Heaven and hell were not abstract ideas but imminent destinations. Every drought, miscarriage, or cattle disease could be interpreted as divine punishment, or worse, the result of demonic sabotage. In this fragile spiritual environment, the concept of the witch, someone who had willingly allied themselves with Satan, was not just feared. It was hated. Witches were believed to be not simply heretics, but active participants in a spiritual rebellion. Their supposed actions, casting spells, summoning demons, blighting crops, were seen as weapons in the devil's war against Christendom. The Church taught that witches formed pacts with Satan, sealed in blood or sex, and that they gathered at nocturnal shibbats to perform mockery of the Mass, engage in orgies, and plot harm against Christian society. These beliefs were often supported by theologians and clergy, who saw witchcraft as a threat to both the soul and the state. Theologians such as Jean Bodou and the infamous Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer argued that witches endangered all of humanity, and that mercy was, in fact, sin, because to spare a witch was to betray God. The idea of spiritual cleansing became pervasive. Executing witches was viewed as a holy duty, a defense of Christian purity. Even rulers and magistrates, who might have had more secular concerns, were swept into this theology of paranoia. They saw themselves as instruments of divine justice, purging evil to restore divine favor to their lands. This marriage of state and church, law and theology, created a potent machine of persecution. Ordinary people, especially women, bore the weight of these ideologies. A midwife who failed to save a baby, an herbalist whose cures failed, a widow who lived alone, these were the ones most likely to be accused, tortured, and banned. It is essential to understand, the people who committed these acts did not think they were evil. They believed they were defending the world from damnation. Their faith, twisted by fear and stoked by political ambition, created a reality where mass hysteria became moral obligation. The witch hunts of the Middle Ages and Renaissance disproportionately targeted women, Estimates suggest that around 75% to 85% of those accused and executed were female. But why? This was not just coincidence, it was the product of deep-rooted beliefs about gender roles, female nature, and power dynamics within medieval society. In a world ruled largely by patriarchal norms and rigid religious doctrine, women were often seen as morally weaker and more susceptible to temptation by the devil. The infamous treatise Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, explicitly argued that women's natural weaknesses, such as curiosity, deceitfulness, and lust, made them prime candidates for witchcraft. The church and society cast women in a paradoxical role, idealized as pure, obedient mothers and virgins, yet feared as dangerous seductresses and conspirators with evil. Women who defied these norms, widows, healers, midwives, outspoken or independent women, were seen as threatening social order and susceptible to accusations. Moreover, women's traditional roles as healers and caretakers placed them in a precarious position. Midwives, who delivered babies and tended the sick, were often accused of using herbal knowledge for dark magic. The very skills that made them valuable were twisted into signs of witchcraft. The fear of female power also intersected with anxieties about sexuality. The devil was often imagined as a horned male figure, and women were accused of sexual congress with him, a sin that symbolized ultimate moral corruption. The supposed witches' Shabbats included stories of orgies and devil worship, framing women as both victims and willing agents of Satan. This gendered persecution reinforced social control. Accusations silenced women who stepped outside accepted roles and cemented male dominance in religious, social, and political life. Women were scapegoats not only for religious fears but also for economic tensions. Widows who inherited land, women who managed businesses, or those without male protectors were vulnerable targets in communities facing hardship. The witch hunts thus became a means to police gender and consolidate power by eradicating what was perceived as feminine deviance or threat. Once accused, the fate of alleged witches was sealed within a brutal judicial system designed more to extract confessions than to seek justice. Trials for witchcraft combined legal, religious, and social mechanisms that fed on fear, superstition, and the thirst for control. Courtrooms were often grim places. Accused witches faced hostile judges, inquisitors, and terrified communities eager for a culprit to blame for misfortunes. Trials could last days or even weeks, with suspects denied basic rights, including legal counsel. Confessions were central to these proceedings, yet they were nearly always obtained under horrific torture. Instruments designed to inflict unbearable pain coerced victims into admitting guilt, naming accomplices, or describing fantastical Shabbats and pacts with the devil. Common torture methods included the rack, which stretched the body until joints dislocated, thumb screws that crushed fingers, the strappado, which suspended victims by their wrists behind their backs, often dislocating shoulders, and the use of pointed needles or iron pincers on sensitive areas. These tortures were justified by authorities as necessary to root out evil and protect society. Yet many innocent people were broken physically and mentally, confessing to crimes they never committed. Once a confession was extracted, the accused were usually condemned swiftly. Execution methods varied. Burning at the stake was most common, symbolizing purification through fire. Hanging or beheading were also used, depending on local customs and the social status of the victim. These public executions served as terrifying spectacles, meant to deter others and reinforce the church's authority. Crowds gathered to witness the suffering, reflecting the era's grim fascination with death and divine justice. The witch trials were thus a dark machinery fueled by fear, religious zealotry, and social control. They destroyed thousands of lives and spread an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. The witch hunts shattered the very fabric of medieval communities, leaving scars far beyond the flames and dungeons. Fear became a constant companion, twisting neighborly trust into suspicion and hatred. No one was truly safe from accusation, old grudges, rivalries, or even simple misunderstandings could spark deadly witch trials. Villages and towns were plunged into paranoia. Families tore themselves apart. Neighbors betrayed each other. And entire communities lived under the shadow of fear. The hunts created a culture of silence, where speaking out could bring ruin, and accusations spread like wildfire. This atmosphere fed the power of religious authorities, who claimed the right to identify and punish witches as defenders of the faith. The Church's influence expanded, enforcing strict moral codes and doctrinal conformity under the guise of protecting souls. Economically, many communities suffered as able-bodied members were imprisoned or executed, disrupting agriculture, crafts, and trade. Women, often the primary caretakers and healers, were disproportionately targeted, leaving families vulnerable. Yet, the hunts also exposed tensions beneath the surface, between emerging ideas and rigid tradition, between rural folkways and centralized power. Some intellectuals and clergy began questioning the methods and morality of witch trials, sowing early seeds of skepticism. The cultural legacy of the hunts lingered for centuries. Folklore and literature absorbed the imagery of witches, demons, and evil she-arts, shaping Western views of magic and the occult. Even after the decline of formal trials, the fear of witchcraft persisted in popular imagination. Ultimately, the witch hunts stand as a stark reminder of how fear and fanaticism can destroy communities and distort justice. They reveal the dark side of human nature, the capacity for cruelty when reason is overshadowed by superstition. Despite the overwhelming tide of fear and violence that characterized the witch hunts, history records the courage and intellect of a few individuals who dared to challenge the hysteria. These skeptics and early critics often came from within the Church or from the emerging scholarly community of the Renaissance, whose humanist ideals emphasized reason and evidence over superstition. One such figure was the Spanish Inquisitor Juan de Mariana, who, despite his role in the Inquisition, expressed doubts about the legitimacy of witchcraft accusations, warning against false testimonies and the dangers of mass paranoia. His writings hinted at the importance of fair trial and the rule of law, ideals that were radical in a time when confessions were often extracted under torture. Similarly, the German scholar Johann Weyer stood out as a pioneer of rational thought. In his work De Praestiges Daemonum, On the Tricks of Demons, Weyer argued that many accused witches were actually suffering from mental illness or delusions, rather than being in league with the devil. He condemned the cruelty of witch trials and urged authorities to show mercy and seek medical understanding instead. These voices did not immediately stop the hunts, but they planted seeds of doubt that would grow over the following centuries, contributing to the gradual decline of witch persecutions by the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The religious context of the hunts is crucial to understanding their intensity. The late medieval and early modern periods were times of immense religious upheaval. The Catholic Church, faced with the Protestant Reformation, sought to reinforce its authority and orthodoxy. Witchcraft was framed not just as a crime but as a heresy, a direct attack on the divine order. Rituals, sermons, and theological treatises all reinforced the image of witches as agents of Satan. threatening the moral and spiritual health of society. This was a period when belief in the supernatural was widespread and taken literally. Miracles, demons, angels, and divine punishment were everyday realities in the minds of most Europeans. Moreover, the social and political instability of the time, from wars to famine to plagues, intensified the search for scapegoats. Witches were convenient symbols of evil, blamed for everything from failed crops to mysterious illnesses. This mingling of religion, superstition, and social anxiety created a perfect storm that fed the fires of persecution. The cultural fabric of Europe was also deeply influenced by these beliefs. Art, literature, and folklore depicted witches as sinister figures with grotesque powers, shaping popular imagination for generations. Festivals and rituals both celebrated and feared the supernatural, reinforcing communal identities even as they fueled divisions. In this complex web of faith, fear, and authority, the witch hunts reveal how deeply intertwined religion and culture were, and how difficult it was to disentangle truth from myth in a world governed by both spiritual and temporal powers. The machinery of the witch hunts was brutal and meticulously organized. Once suspicion fell upon an individual, often a vulnerable woman, the process of accusation, arrest, and trial began, a terrifying ordeal that was as much about public spectacle as it was about extracting confessions. Local authorities, sometimes pressured by religious leaders or fearful communities, arrested the accused and placed them in often deplorable conditions. Jails were overcrowded, dark, and unsanitary. Prisoners faced physical and psychological torment before the trial even began. Interrogation was conducted with relentless cruelty. Torture was not an unfortunate byproduct but rather a sanctioned tool to break the accused and force confessions. Methods varied widely. The rack stretched bodies to the point of excruciating pain. Thumbscrews crushed fingers, and sleep deprivation left prisoners delirious. The use of torture rested on the premise that witches were servants of the devil and would like to protect themselves unless subjected to extreme measures. Confessions obtained under such duress were often grotesque fabrications, accused witches describing pacts with Satan, participation in nocturnal sabbaths, and acts of maleficium, harmful magic. Trials were theatrical and designed to reinforce the power of the church and state. Judges, often without legal training but empowered by ecclesiastical or royal authority, conducted proceedings that blurred the lines between justice and ritual. The accused had little real chance to defend themselves. Evidence was circumstantial or based on spectral evidence, claims that the spirit or shape of the accused appeared to victims to torment them. An impossible claim to refute. Community members, driven by fear or personal vendettas, often testified against neighbors, sometimes eagerly, sometimes out of coercion or hysteria. Accusations could be triggered by jealousy, land disputes, or simply the desire to explain misfortune. Sentences were swift and severe. Execution methods varied. Hanging was common in England, while burning at the stake was prevalent on the continent. These public executions served as warnings, reinforcing the social order and religious orthodoxy. Behind the public facade of justice lay stories of human tragedy: mothers separated from children, elderly women condemned without cause, entire villages traumatized. Many accused witches were outcasts, the poor, or the socially marginalized, highlighting how the hunts were not only religious purges but also social persecutions. Moreover, the paranoia spread like wildfire, feeding on itself. Each confession under torture implicated others, expanding the net of suspicion. Families, friends, and even clergy found themselves drawn into accusations. creating cycles of fear that devastated communities. This dark chapter of history exposes how fear and fanaticism can warp systems of justice, turning neighbors against one another and corrupting the very institutions meant to protect life. For those accused of witchcraft was marked not only by fear of arrest and torture but also by profound social isolation and stigma long before the trial. Neighbors who once greeted each other warmly now whispered suspiciously, avoided eye contact, and barred accused families from communal gatherings. The accused were often women living on the margins, widows, healers, herbalists, or simply those who did not conform to societal norms. Their homes became places of dread. Doors were locked against them, children were warned to stay away. Some were forced to flee, becoming wandering outcasts, constantly looking over their shoulders. Others stayed, enduring suspicion and hostility, sometimes even from their own kin. These accusations fractured communities. Trust broke down as fear fed paranoia. It was not uncommon for families to be torn apart by accusations. Neighbors turned into informers, friends into enemies. The fabric of medieval village life, tightly woven through shared labor, faith, and tradition, frayed dangerously. The impact rippled through society. Local economies suffered when key members of communities were imprisoned or executed. Traditional knowledge, especially that held by midwives and herbal healers, was lost as women who served critical roles in health and childbirth were branded as witches and silenced politically. Witch hunts were sometimes exploited by rulers to consolidate power. Authorities used them to eliminate dissenters, seize property, or demonstrate their devotion to religious orthodoxy. In some regions, witch hunts coincided with social unrest, crop failures, or plague outbreaks, serving as a scapegoat mechanism to channel public frustration. Religious leaders preached fervently against witchcraft, reinforcing the belief that rooting out witches was a holy duty. Sermons invoked fear of the devil's influence, urging communities to be vigilant. Church courts often took the lead in prosecutions, blending spiritual condemnation with legal punishment. However, as the hunts reached their height in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, voices of skepticism began to emerge. Some clergy, scholars, and legal experts questioned the validity of confessions extracted under torture and the reliability of spectral evidence. Gradually, reason and legal reform started to curtail the most extreme practices. Yet the legacy of the witch hunts endured far beyond their decline. They left scars of mistrust, loss, and injustice. Entire regions bore the memory of these persecutions in their folklore and collective psyche, warning future generations about the dangers of fanaticism and mass hysteria. In reflecting on the witch hunts of the Middle Ages, we see a tragic intersection of fear, power, and human vulnerability, a sobering lesson on how easily societies can turn against their own in times of crisis. One of the most infamous witch trials of the Middle Ages was the case of the Pendle witches in early 17th century England. In 1612, 12 people from the Pendle Hill area in Lancashire were accused of witchcraft. The accusations stemmed from local disputes, personal vendettas, and widespread fear of unexplained misfortunes like illness and crop failure. The accused were arrested and tried before a court that heavily relied on confessions extracted under torture and the testimonies of other accused witches. The trial was notable for its harshness and the sensational atmosphere it created. Many of the accused were elderly women, viewed as outsiders or eccentric figures in their communities. Despite the flimsy and contradictory evidence, 10 were found guilty and hanged, marking one of the last mass executions for witchcraft in England. In continental Europe, The Salem witch trials in late 17th century colonial America would later echo similar patterns, with accusations spreading rapidly and community hysteria culminating in the execution of 20 people, most of them women. These events underscored how fear and superstition could overwhelm reason, even in a society steeped in religious doctrine and emerging legal systems. Facing increasing criticism and the horrors exposed by these trials, many legal authorities began to reconsider how witchcraft cases were handled. Influential thinkers such as Reginald Scott in England wrote extensively, arguing that witches did not possess supernatural powers and that the witch hunts were a form of mass delusion fueled by ignorance and fear. The Catholic Church, after centuries of supporting witch hunts through the Inquisition, started to shift its stance during the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, emphasized reform and questioned earlier excesses, promoting a more cautious approach. Some regional bishops and church officials actively discouraged witch trials, urging for more rigorous standards of evidence. Secular courts gradually took over from ecclesiastical courts, applying stricter legal procedures and rejecting confessions gained through torture. By the late 17th century, many European countries had curtailed or outlawed witch hunts altogether. The Enlightenment's rise brought a more rational and scientific worldview, challenging superstition and promoting human rights. Yet the memory of these dark chapters remained etched in cultural consciousness. The witch hunts stand as a stark reminder of the dangers posed when fear, power, and dogma override justice and compassion. The era of witch hunts came to an end not through sudden enlightenment, but through gradual shifts in society, law, and belief. As Europe moved towards modernity, the grip of superstition loosened, replaced by reason, science, and legal fairness. The tragic episodes of mass hysteria, fear, and injustice that defined the witch hunts became cautionary tales for future generations. The legacy of this dark period reveals much about human nature, how fear can corrupt justice, how societies can scapegoat the vulnerable, and how power structures can manipulate belief to maintain control. Yet, it also shows the enduring strength of human progress and empathy. As communities eventually rejected fanaticism and embraced dignity and rights for all. Today, the story of the witch hunts reminds us to remain vigilant against intolerance and to question narratives that demonize the other. It teaches the importance of critical thinking and compassion in the face of fear. The whispers of those accused and condemned centuries ago still echo, urging us to build societies rooted in justice, reason, and humanity. The terrifying fanaticism of the witch hunts is thus not just a historical curiosity, but a timeless warning and a call to protect the values that safeguard human freedom and dignity.